Welcome to the next section of this course. I admit the stuff we covered in the last section might not have been the most exciting stuff you have seen in the world of Unity. This is because we basically just covered prerequisites one needs to work with Unity version control. We now know what tools and accounts we need. Do I like the complexity it introduces? Not really. I would prefer to have everything available in Unity without the need for additional software or accounts. But hey, it is what it is. The good news is that now that we have seen all the tools, we are ready to talk about the important stuff, which is how do we work with them. Good version control is never just about tools, but rather about good workflows and best practices. Speaking about workflows, let's go to Unity and look at one. Once again, we are in a fresh Unity project. I won't go through the project creation anymore from now on. We have seen examples in the previous section. Also note that depending on which template you create your project from, or whether you already run the game mode, you might see changes in setting files in here. Unity does this automatically. Don't worry about them, they are not relevant for the stuff we want to talk about in this video. Let's start with the most basic element we need for version control with Plastic, which is a change set. In order to have something to talk about, it's probably a good idea to have a couple of change sets. So let's pretend we are working on the next AAA game and start creating some really creative level. How about a cube as ground? A couple of spheres. And because it is a AAA game, we also want to give them some color. Just like that, we have created 3 new change sets. And I noticed that I already made a first mistake in the new project, which is that I forgot to save the scene. This is very important when you work with Plastic. You might think that Plastic gets exactly what you see in the editor, but this is not true for the scene. The unsaved scene file, which we can currently observe, is just temporary. When we closed the Unity editor, the changes would be gone. The same is true for version control. I have to save the file, and only then the scene file appears in the pending changes. Let's just quickly fix this with an additional check-in. Once we have done that, let's jump to Plastic and have a closer look at what actually happened. We can see 6 circles. Each circle represents a change set. The first 2 circles were created automatically by Unity. We talked about that. The other 4 are the ones we just created. The green one is just an indicator for the currently selected change set, and the house is showing where our workspace currently is. So while we're at it, why not show that version control is actually good for something and travel back in history? How about we look at this change set where we had added the material but forgot to save the scene. When we right-click over the change set, we can choose Switch Workspace to this change set. At first glance, it looks as if nothing happened. But when we bring the mouse focus to the Unity editor, it tells us that it noticed a change to the scene file, which we can reload. When we do, we get the scene in exactly the state before we added the colored material. Unity also tells us down here that there is a new change set available, which makes sense because we just traveled to the second to last change set, so there is one newer one available. Obviously, we could also go back even further, maybe before we even added the spheres. And that's exactly what we get. Technically, you could also go back to the very first change set, but remember that the first two change sets are created by default and are setting up our project. This means, for example, that the default packages are not yet defined in the very first change set. I don't want to add any further confusion by going into those details. If you're interested, try it out. For all the others, just always start with the third change set. Or in other words, with your first real change set. Okay, so change sets are sort of snapshots of our project, to which we can travel or to which we can revert our work if we did something wrong. But I don't really like sort of definitions. What are they really? Two ideas might be reasonable, but are both wrong. The first idea might be that at each of those points, a whole copy of the project is stored. Essentially, the whole workspace. We would have 6 workspaces in our case. Obviously, this would not be the best idea because it would take up a lot of space once our project grows. So this is not what happens. The other idea would be to store just the files that changed. And that is much closer to what actually happens, but it's not the whole story either. File contents are not enough to recreate a project, since files might be renamed, moved, copied, etc. If you look closer at the picture, you can see arrows between the dots. These arrows always point to the previous change set. And this is actually a good hint. So the best informal definition I have for a change set is that it's a recipe how to get from one project state to the next one. Or in our picture here, from one dot to the next one. Let's add something to our glossary for completeness, but I will offer you 2 options here. If all you want is to quickly utilize plastic, and you don't need it for a really big project yet maybe, over which you will have very fine-grained control, you can think of a change set just as a set of modified items. I will, however, also add a definition which is closer to the truth, and if you are interested in how plastic works under the hood, there will be an optional video showing an example. You can totally work with plastic in 9 of 10 cases without that knowledge, but some things will only make sense once you go a bit deeper. From the more practical perspective, we can note that each change set has useful metadata, parts of which we can see here on the right. For example, you can see when a change set was created or who created it. And one question you might have asked by now is, how do we identify a change set? Unfortunately, there are also 2 answers to that question. If you work with a cloud repository as we do currently, and each collaborator always works with the same repository that is in sync, it's enough to consider the object name property at the top. This is essentially just an incremented number for each change set. We can also find it when we hover over the dots or in the navigation or location string at the top. Notice when we change to a different change set, this string also updates. The same thing happens in Unity. By the way, if you wonder why we are at 7 in this case, it comes from the fact that I had to correct something for the video and removed some previous change sets. So when we created the change sets in the video, it just kept incrementing. For our simple case, it is enough to consider those simple numbers as identifiers. But if you work in a slightly more complex scenario and maybe have a distributed setup where the repositories are not always in sync, there is a way to globally identify a change set, and that is the GUID a few lines below. So Plastic could have only worked with a global ID like Git does, for example, but it decided to add a more convenient option for the centralized approach, which is probably rather common for Unity. It's just nice to be able to write to your colleague, hey, can you check out changeset number 7, instead of having to say, hey, check out changeset 0F00C285. So you get the point. Okay, I think that's enough for a first glance on changesets. They are one of the basic building blocks of Plastic, so we will work with them basically throughout the whole course. There is one other thing, however, that is related to the topic of changesets and which might be confusing at the beginning. If we go back to Unity and look at the pending changes, we can see that there is nothing there. So we might get the impression that everything about the workspace is under version control. By that I mean all the files. But that is not necessarily the case. Remember a few videos ago we changed a setting in order to have an easier beginning which filtered out some files. Let's now change that back again. Under Options, I can check Show Private Files, and again we get a whole bunch of files appearing in the pending changes. All those files have a status called Private. What do you think will happen if I change the workspace to another change set? Let's try. For example, change set 5. What changed? Nothing. The same files which appeared in the latest change set also appear in change set 5. And believe it or not, no matter what change set you would go to, you would always see the same files appear as private. So what is that private status? Private to what? That's what we will talk about in the next video.